Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Doug Henwood, a longtime left activist, writer, economic analyst. He is a contributing editor at The Nation and also hosts a weekly program on KPFA. He is also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. Thanks for joining us, Doug.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I wanted to go a little bit into your background because I was watching and listening to some of your previous interviews to prepare for today, and I found it interesting that you sort of grew up a socialist, then went to the right, and then came back to socialism.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and sort of how you became politicized?
Well, I had an 8th grade history teacher. I went to public schools in New Jersey. And I had this 8th grade history teacher who otherwise was very undistinguished, kind of a coach type. But he gave a sympathetic lecture on Marx one day, and I thought, I came home and told my parents I'd become a Marxist, much to their distress. But I stayed that way. I read, some Marx, but not kind of unformed adolescent fashion. And then very late in high school, I became a conservative, and it lasted for, about a year and a half or so. When I got to Yale, I joined something called the Party of the Right, which was a very small and nutty reactionary formation that had several factions, one of which was libertarian, but there were actually some monarchists mixed in with it. And that lasted into the beginning of my sophomore year, and I got out of that and went back to being on the left. So it was like an aberration of about a year and a half. It was my form of adolescent rebellion in the early 70s when everyone else was marching in the streets and doing drugs. I was a Bill Buckley conservative.
Wow, that was going to be my question. What were the years? When were you, you were getting out of high school in the middle of the 70s?
I graduated from high school in 71, got to Yale, and I was in the Party of the Right the years 71, 72. And in those days, there were very, very few conservatives. It was just, maybe a dozen of us that were semi-active in the Party of the Right. And it was funny to me, like less than 10 years later, to see Ronald Reagan take office, basically adhering to a philosophy that we all thought was doomed and pretty much dead in the early 70s. So it was quite a revival, that kind of movement conservatives. Or not exactly a revival, since some of it was kind of new, but to see movement conservatism become the dominant political force in the country 10 years after it had seemed on the verge of death was a remarkable development to watch. And then, watch the debasements of conservatism that succeeded that. We were very intellectually snobbish. We thought that part of the problem with the world in those days was standards were just all falling to hell, and Western civilization was going to the dogs, and we were going to be the last line of defense against barbarism. And then to see what has happened to the conservative intellectual tradition since, to see the idiocies and stupidities that really dominate it now. It's just it's remarkable to somebody who went through that period in the early 70s. If you look back, for example, at some of the speeches that Ronald Reagan gave to the Conservative Political Action Conference in the mid-70s, I'm sure somebody wrote them for him, but they were kind of serious efforts at political philosophy, and compare that to what goes on at CPAC now, and it's just like night and day. Something very badly happened to the American conservative movement when it became a dominant force.
We are a long way from Edmund Burke.
Very.
I'm interested. I mean, I didn't live through that period. I was born in 84, and one of the things that strikes me looking back at that history is it's only 11 years from Woodstock to fucking Reagan. That's amazing to me.
Yeah, really, yes.
Because when you're young, you go.
It was a remarkable period. The 70s, the 70s are maligned as a very dull period, but they're actually quite lively. Began the decade with a bunch of wildcat strikes. Nixon had to call out the National Guard to deliver the mail, and 10 years later, Reagan was busting the Air Traffic Controllers Union and launching a war on labor. So it's just an awful lot happened in that 10 years.
Where were you at by the time Reagan takes office in 1980?
Oh, I was very firmly on the left. I was actually on a business trip. I was working for a small medical publisher in New York in those days, and I got sent on a business trip to Atlanta to present our books at a conference. And it was election night, and I ordered room service and a bottle of wine and thought, oh, this can be fun to watch election returns. And it was over in like 10 minutes. and I was stunned. So I went up to the revolving restaurant at the top of the Hyatt and just drank heavily to try to deal with my distress at the election of Reagan. It was just surreal. I was stunned. I took a picture of myself in a photo booth at the airport the next morning, and between the drinking of the night before and the despair at Reagan's election, I just looked like hell, because it was so shocking. And I kind of felt the same way when Trump was elected, that same feeling of just disbelief and shock that this can't be true, and we're headed for some really, really bad times. And both prognoses turned out to be correct.
What do you think are some of the lessons that can be learned from left activism in the 1980s and 90s? I feel like these are periods that we don't talk about very often, but as someone who got involved with the left around 2006 when I came home from Iraq and joined Iraq Veterans Against the War, I got involved with the anti-war movement. At that time in 2006, the only socialist groups around were like handing out newspapers at the rallies or at local universities. There wasn't much of an organized institutional left, at least a socialist left.
Oh God, no! It's just so different now. I founded my newsletter in 1986. I thought at that point that the Reagan years are going to come to a bad end, and people would wake up, and there would be a great revival of the left, and that just never happened. So there were very, very lonely times. If you go to a meeting, it was like 10 people in some beaten-down old room, and half the people had tenuous connections to reality. It was a very dark time, and to see what happened starting around 2015 with the Bernie campaign and the aftermath, to see the growth of a young left over the last 5 years or so has just been beautiful and inspiring to somebody like me who felt really alienated from the whole system. I remember being at a conference with a friend of mine in, probably late 90s sometime, and she turned to me and said, I've been a socialist for my whole life, and I'm embarrassed to use the word publicly. And that really captured the feeling that one had at the time. You just felt like a freak.
Right. What kind of projects, because I feel like those of us who did come up in the aughts, I think, should pay some respect to those who came before us, insofar as the people who remained active after the 70s through the 80s and 90s. That sort of paved the ground for a lot of us who came up, during that Bush era. I got exposed to Left Business Observer, Z Communications, various other left websites and, media entities and so forth. And that helped orientate us to some degree. Even though it wasn't as established as it is today, I feel like people from that era deserve some credit.
Well, I felt like we were keeping the flame alive, but it seemed pretty lonely, and it was really hard to. It was really impossible to imagine we'd see anything like we do today, with a socialist caucus developing the New York State legislature. It's impossible to imagine. Even 10 years ago, something like that happening. One of the things that I did during that period was I ran a listserv, starting in the late 90s, ran through. I finally shut it down a little while ago, but it had died out because of social media. It really took over from the listserv world. But some of the principles of Jacobin magazine met each other through that. So I think that I had some catalytic effect on the Jacobin project getting going. But that's what we're going to do. Just keep alive a flame until a younger generation in a different time could let that flame burn a little brighter and hotter.
Well, let's bring us up to today. We were involved, of course, in the Bernie campaign in 2015 and 2016. Since then, we opened a community center here in Michigan City, Indiana. It's like a community cultural center that we use. Well, prior to COVID, we used it for organizing efforts primarily, but also social and cultural events. And so, Bernie loses the primary in 2020. Of course, all of us were heartbroken on Super Tuesday. Less than a week later, the country shut down. It's COVID. Biden's the nominee and all the rest. We know sort of the context in which we're in today. Where do you see the left going today? It seems to me we have a good project in DSA. There's great workplace organizing. We followed the work of Jane McAlevey, and a lot of great union efforts that are happening both near us in Chicago, but also throughout the country. And so I guess I'm wondering, what do you make of our position today? We have an election coming up. I know you believe it makes sense to strategically vote for Biden, but you have no illusions of what a Biden presidency is going to bring us. So I guess I'm asking, what do you make of where the left is today, and where do you think we should go from here?
Well, I think I have a two-part answer to that. One is on the question of Biden. Just back in 1968, Gary Wills published a book called Nixon Agonistes about Richard Nixon. One of the points he made in that, which I've thought about ever since, was that one of the reasons the 60s happened was that during the 50s, when Eisenhower was president, all these people, left-wing intellectuals and such, thought, all the problem is just Eisenhower. If we get our guy in there, everything's going to be better. And so they got JFK in there, who was in many ways their kind of guy, serious, cerebral, well-read, kind of a sophisticated character. And it turned out that everything still pretty much sucked. So that disillusionment was then very productive. It's caused people to say, well, the system is at stake. The system is at fault, rather. So this is that's what kind of helped give rise to the radicalism of the 60s. I think something semi-similar happened in the 90s with Bill Clinton. We saw the rise of the anti-globalization movement that culminated in Seattle in 1999. So that kind of disillusionment, when people get the Democrat after a long period of Republican or conservative rule, and then find that things really haven't changed that much for the better, then maybe they'll be moved towards more radical politics. But there's already now, there's a much larger base for that kind of radical politics than there was in 1964, or there was in 1998 for sure. So that's one thing that gives me hope, that people will, not that a whole lot of people have great expectations for Biden, but he's talking about appointing Republicans to his cabinet in an effort to be bipartisan. I just, this constant urge to be bipartisan with a Republican Party that wants to destroy them just seems suicidal and bizarre to me. But there's just no stopping that impulse. But what, as marvelous as the Bernie campaigns were, especially the first one, and catalyzing this whole new movement of younger left activists and intellectuals, the presidency is basically the big boy's office. As the people at Workers' Vanguard used to say, the president of the United States is the chief executive of the world's bourgeoisie. It's really the very summit of class power. And they're going to fight for that office. It's really their natural terrain. And so for somebody like Bernie Sanders to contest seriously for that office was remarkable development, but it's a really steep hill to climb. But what we're seeing now, at least in the realm of electoral politics, they're kind of organizing at lower levels in city councils and state legislatures, and to some degree House of Representatives. That seems to be much more promising for building a long-term movement, especially if those electoral movements are linked to non-electoral politics, like union organizing or anti-gentrification movements, or housing justice movements, or anti-police brutality stuff. If we have that kind of two-pronged effort of the electoral side and the non-electoral side, really focused on very concrete local issues, but networked nationally, I think that's really a very promising situation. So, now we're going to have, I think, 4 or 5 socialists in the New York State legislature. The Chicago City Council has, 5 socialists on it. Yep. These are not enormous numbers, but they really do begin to make a serious difference. And the fact that the left is now taken seriously as a political force is just striking to me, for having been so long in the wilderness. So that stuff I think is extremely promising, and that really seems to be where the action is. I just noticed that there's an article on the Politico website, the Politico New York website, about what's happening with the New York State Nurses Association, which had been a very sleepy Orthodox union. And then some DSA people came in and decided to try to shake things up, not be a rubber stamp for the governor anymore, but also to do things that the public might support, like supporting staffing ratios to make sure that there are enough nurses per patient, which you'd think would be very popular with the public, but not necessarily popular with the governor or the hospital industry. So now this is provoking a great bit of struggle within the union, but it's just really inspiring to see that kind of leadership light a fire under what had been a very weak and brain dead labor union. So I think we have a lot of potential there in other places around the country. I know that a lot of DSA people are getting involved in various occupations in order to be at strategic locations in the economy, but also to organize and educate. That sort of thing strikes me as extremely promising as well. So yeah, all that union work, issue work, plus electoral organizing. There seems to be a lot of promise in that, and as DSA continues to grow, somewhat surprisingly perhaps, but I think there's a great deal of promise. God knows what happens if Trump gets reelected, and right. The armed white supremacists go on a rampage. Although I guess they could also go on a rampage if Trump loses. But there is some degree of hope there. And, something like the Green New Deal, given the combination of the health crisis we're in, the economic crisis we're in, something like the Green New Deal no longer seems fanciful to me. It seems like very practical politics.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're hearing that from people who aren't, heavy into left politics. Living in Northwest Indiana, I will admit that I was not in the least bit surprised at Donald Trump's victory in 2016, not because I think we had any kind of special insight, but it was one of the first times that I had allowed my anecdotal experiences to really color what I was feeling about an election. And living around Michigan, Wisconsin, having friends in Minnesota, Ohio, et cetera, it seemed very clear to us that Trump was far more popular than a lot of left commentators gave him sort of credit for during the primary, and, of course, a lot of the liberal commentators who couldn't even imagine the amount of people who supported him.
Does it feel different to you this time around?
It feels fundamentally different to me this time around. In fact, almost all of the people who were sort of the apolitical voters, people who are like, fuck the system, everything sucks, I'm going to show up and vote for Trump because I hate Hillary Clinton. Those people this time around are either not voting or they're voting for Biden. Most of the apolitical people I know are voting for Biden instead of sitting on the sidelines. And most of the leftists I know who otherwise wouldn't vote in previous elections are voting for Biden. So all of that seems promising to me.
Yeah, that's encouraging. Because, look back in 2016, Trump was a great way to flip the bird to the system, but now he is the system, and he really made a big mess of things. So it seems to be a very different environment for him to run for re-election than it did the first time.
Yeah, 100%. And, here we've been ravaged by deindustrialization, neoliberalism. I mean, we used to have 120,000 union steelworking jobs stretching from the south side of Chicago to South Bend, Indiana, and today we have a little less than 10,000. And that's...
Yeah, and he didn't bring it back like he promised.
That's right. And there's a lot of steel workers in the region who recognize that. I think some of them maybe not so vocally and publicly, but, to some degree there's this sense that they've been had. And, that's not a bad thing.
He is a very accomplished con artist. 4-decade career as a con artist.
That was like the ongoing conversation with my friends in the mill, or the guys who work at the factories that still remain. I'd be like, come on, like, you guys know this guy's never had a callus on his hand in his whole fucking life. It's just like trying to talk to them about, like, if you saw this guy at the bar, you'd probably get in a fight with him. You wouldn't be voting for him. It's like those kind of conversations I've actually found are much more useful than hitting them with, like, hey, Trump's tax plan is bad. That actually resonates with these guys more than the other stuff.
Well, that's good.
One of the things
I'm here in the bubble of Brooklyn, so I don't get to speak with a lot of people like that.
Yeah, we interviewed Liza last month, and we were kind of joking about that. One of the things I wanted to get back to, because I think the point you make is really important, and that is I've been also surprised at the level of sophistication on the left that exists today, all the way from how we approach electoral politics. In other words, most of the younger people that are now coming up that we're working with, they don't even bother with the Green Party. Whereas 10, 15 years ago when I was getting involved, there was still this discussion about, should we go with the Greens? If there's electoral efforts, should we support the Greens? It's like, to me, thankfully, and I have friends in the Green Party, they're decent, nice people. But I feel like that project is dead, and the sooner we just come to the realization that that's not an option, the better off we'll be.
Well, yeah, now they've been around for what? I guess it's kind of hard to date when they began because they've gone through so many formations. But go back to 1995 or so, 25 years, and they've gone nowhere. The peak vote year for president was Nader in 2000, which brought perpetual stain on the Green Party for that electoral result. I
Right.
don't believe that was Nader's fault that Bush won, but still a lot of people think that. But that was their peak 20 years ago, and they've never been able to build anything from that. I think the whole project is just doomed. Part of the problem is U.S. electoral law. It makes it really, really difficult for a third party to establish itself. And the way the DSA people have been using the Democratic Party ballot line, I think, has been very creative and thoughtful. Just run the primaries, but really don't let the party take you over. Don't act like you're a member of the party. Just take advantage of them, and maybe someday we can throw them away.
Yeah. Yeah, and the level of sophistication with regard to workplace organizing as well. I just spoke to a local organizer yesterday on the phone. He's being furloughed. He works for Amtrak, and he's wondering, where should I go to work next? And his sort of number one consideration is what workplace makes what sector makes the most sense for me to join to organize. So he's thinking Amazon. He's thinking, the various other industries that are in the region, which industries need to be organized. That's a level of sophistication that definitely did not exist when I first got involved.
Oh, yeah, I think it's extremely impressive to me. I mean, my friends and colleagues in the Brooklyn chapter of DSA, very few of them are over 35, but the level of wisdom and the collegiality, the culture of it is just all really nice. For someone who was used to the left in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, when we're all really mean to each other, we thought we were like mini Lenins who could just have a really sharp tongue and denounce our opponents and be really clever. It's nice to see people who treat each other in a comradely fashion for a change.
Yeah, I agree with you. The only thing I'll say is that I do think some of the witty sniping is sometimes fun.
Oh yeah, I'm not going to give that up entirely, but it used to be so mean, and not in a fun way. It was just like everybody's just so mean to each other, and to an older person, some of the rituals that DSA people go through. Remember at the convention last year, people had a lot of fun with the twinkling and the language policing, and I can understand why people find it annoying or silly, but their underlying impulse to treat each other well is something that really moves me.
Yeah, I agree. And it's something that I think resonates with people who aren't on the left that we're trying to bring in. I think that vibe, the culture, what the initial sense people get when they walk through the door, hey, are these cool people that I might not... Yeah, I know it sounds silly because we used to say this about George W. Bush, is this somebody you'd want to have a beer with? But I do think that there is some truth to that when it comes to activism, that if people come into organizing spaces and they get that vibe that, oh man, these people are kind of shitty to each other, they're not really nice, they're not fun to hang out with, it's just an impediment to our organizing.
Yeah, as my late friend Bob Fitch used to say, socialism must be social. I think a lot of people forget that part.
So here we are today, the election's in 2 weeks. It seems to me that if Biden, or it looks like he'll get elected, but we don't know for sure, of course. Let's say he is elected. We could go through both scenarios. It seems to me, and I'm wondering if you agree with this, that his leash and the honeymoon period is going to be a lot different than it was for Barack Obama in 2008. That, in fact, a lot of people, as the polls show, are simply voting for Joe Biden out of a sense of, necessity to get rid of Trump. But there's not all of this great hope wrapped up in the Biden campaign. And it would seem to me that if indeed he gets elected, it's not going to take a long period of time before people go, wait a minute, we need massive programs to deal with the situation that we're in. He's not necessarily offering the kind of programs we need. There seems to me that there's going to be a pushback a lot quicker than there was with Obama in office. Do you think so?
Oh, I think that's absolutely true because, Obama was elected with a whole lot of expectations. We're in the midst of this economic crisis. We're exhausted by all the wars and stupidities and brutalities of the Bush era. So people voted for Obama thinking they were going to get a more peaceful and more egalitarian world. And, the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress for the first 2 years of his presidency, and they really didn't do much. The initial stimulus bill was okay, but it was certainly short of what was necessary. But people's expectations out of Obama were very high, and then he eventually dashed them rather quickly. Well, it's like only 3 or 4 months into his presidency, and either he or somebody in his administration called up the New York Times columnist David Brooks and started talking about how they wanted to, when the crisis was over, they wanted to cut Social Security and Medicare. So they were really not at all trying to pull some kind of second coming of FDR with that administration, even though they control both houses of Congress. They could have had a very ambitious agenda with a degree of presidential leadership. There could have been a whole lot of good stuff that went down in the early Obama years, and it didn't. And so people's expectations were dashed. Now, I remember talking to one of the organizers of the Black Youth Project in Chicago, who said that a lot of people who organized for his group cut their teeth on the Obama campaign, and their disillusionment is what turned into more radical politics. So that productive quality of disillusionment with Democrats, I think, is a repeating theme in American politics of the last few decades. But people's expectations of Biden are low. I mean, that's in every sense. He goes into a debate, and as long as he doesn't piss on himself, people think it's a success. And Trump has now, ratcheted down the expectations for Biden's debate performances. So even in the mainstream, he's got very low expectations, and certainly nobody in the left has very high expectations for what Biden is going to do. I think there's not going to be that same honeymoon period. Now, I imagine there's going to be a lot among mainstream Democrats, a lot of relief that, assuming Biden wins, we always have to offer that caveat many times. Right. But there will be a great deal of relief to be rid of Trump, and I know I will feel that. That the insanity of the last 3.5, 4 years it's been wearing people down on a very personal level. I mean, the combination of Trump's idiocy and violence and nastiness with the COVID epidemic and all the social isolation that's come with that, and the unemployment that's come with that. I mean, people are really emotionally raw. I can't remember another time when the quality of politics influenced people's personal lives on such a powerful level. So there will be some relief that Trump is gone. But on the other hand, if Biden comes in and appoints some of these names that have been floating around, the Republican names have been floating around to his cabinet, there are going to be a lot of really annoyed people, even fairly, mainstream liberal Democrats. That's not what they want. They don't want Republicans in office, not even, the good, never Trump Republicans. They want things to go in a different direction. And there is a left now within the Democratic Party or adjacent to the Democratic Party to act as a pressure force that just didn't exist in the early Obama years. It's going to be, I think, a very, very different thing. And even Biden, despite his instinctive conservatism or caution, has at least partly endorsed a Green New Deal. So, I mean, that's a good thing. He seems to understand that there has to be some kind of ambitious spending and investment program, some degree of redistribution, some income support for people at the lower end of the income ladder. So, I mean, he does have some good instincts in that direction. But it's going to take an awful lot of pressure to cause him to fight for those things, but also to get him to open up to other possibilities as well.
What do you think the left's orientation to a potential Biden presidency would be? So let me just break this down real quick. I would like to get your thoughts on this. So on the one hand, if Biden gets into office, we can expect that he's going to propose the legislation that you mentioned, some of them quasi-redistributionists. There's going to be proposed tax increases. There's going to be infrastructure bills. So on the one hand, we're going to need a left, unions, DSA, different organizations that pressure Democrats to pass the existing legislation that Biden proposes, but we're going to want that legislation to be even better than it is. So we're going to be pressuring them to have even more robust policies. But at the same time, if we don't get those, we're going to at least want him to pass even milquetoast reformist legislation. While that's happening, my assumption would be that we're going to have Trump's base still out there sort of in like a Tea Party 2.0 mode, where they're going to be attacking Biden and the Democrats with all kinds of baseless, crazy claims. And perhaps even, I don't know, engaging in acts of domestic terrorism. So I feel like the left is in this very tricky position of having to critique Biden, having to support certain legislation that he proposes that will want passed, but that will be inadequate, but then also sort of have a position vis-a-vis the state where it's like very clear that the left is opposed to this sort of right-wing violence and so forth. That seems like we're going to have to like chew gum, walk, and ride a bike at the same time.
Yeah, I think, I think that's quite true. And of course, much depends upon whether Mitch McConnell is still running the Senate. We don't know it, but if there's somehow a Democratic Senate, then that will change the calculus significantly. But then the Democrats are also, or at least many Democrats, are capable of being rather conservative themselves. So you're going to see a lot of questioning. Is this too ambitious? Is this too expensive? We're going to hear, should we think about cutting entitlements? All that stuff is going to come back again.
Yep.
So we have to fight that within the Democratic Party. I mean, the more conservative parts of the Democratic Party. At the same time, you're right that the reactionaries are going to be on the march. They're going to be completely up in arms about any slight reformist tendencies that the Biden administration shows. There's always the risk that the armed lunatics will start killing people. Right-wing terrorism. I mean, these are all very, very serious threats. And I alternate between thinking that a Trump defeat would deflate them and then retreat for a while, or thinking that a Trump defeat would inflame them and then just go on the march. I don't know which it's going to be. And a lot of people on the left now are actually taking up gun training. I have to say, I'm not personally fond of guns. I don't own any. I'm not likely to. I'm not likely to shoot anything. But I don't know. I can't say I'm against the Socialist Rifle Association training people how to use firearms. It's a tough time, and a little self-defense might be in order.
I'm very split on the issue as a combat veteran, as someone who's not a pacifist, as someone who, through the Bush era and the Obama era, I remember being in left circles, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, just different organizing efforts over the years, environmental activism and so forth, where activists would bring this up, and in the past, it always seemed to me to be like a sort of navel-gazing exercise about, potential realities that we could be visited upon us in the future. But today, it is a legitimate conversation because there are millions of people around the country who are buying weapons for the first time. And for the first time in our experience, we have left-wing friends who are actively sort of arming themselves and posturing in this way. I do think that we need to finally have a nuanced, serious discussion about it, but I get worried by both sides. I mean, the side that says there's no place for this whatsoever worries me, and then the side that sort of fetishizes weapons and this radical militant posturing also worries me because I've been around extreme violence, and I think I have some knowledge of what it takes to have a organized group of people operating with weapons, and that's in the military where you're living with these people and training with them day after day, and even then it's a fucking disaster.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I completely agree. It's dangerous stuff. But on the other hand, there really are some terrifying folks in the right, white supremacists and Nazis, and I don't know what to do about them. It's not, and I don't think we can rely on the cops to take care of them because the cops are often very sympathetic with them. There was an article in Harper's, 6-8 months ago by James Pogue. I interviewed him on my radio show about the Socialist Rifle Association. And one of the points he makes is that in contrast with the right-wing bearers of arms and the NRA, which have a very individualistic view of weaponry, it's all about defending yourself and your family. Their Socialist Rifle Association has a much more collective notion of self-defense, and they're trying to create a kind of comradeliness among people who are undergoing this training, which is a different culture from the right-wing gun culture. But still, I don't want to see people get blown away. That stuff really makes me uncomfortable. I'm not a pacifist by any means, but I do prefer a peaceful life to a violent one. Yeah.
No, same here. And I think, those of us who are veterans who are firmly on the left and have been for a while, I think we do have some knowledge, some expertise, some advice. And, I've heard from friends in the Pacific Northwest who've been involved in these different sort of efforts. And it helps when they have some solid left-wing veterans around. I think that's a role that, any left-wing veteran who may be listening to this, if you don't see a place for yourself within the movement, that might be a place for you within the movement.
Yeah, and so much of right-wing discourse is about teasing leftists or mocking them for not being manly enough, and it gets to be that's some pretty dangerous territory. Whether insofar as the prove your manliness through firing weapons, that's uncomfortable. But on the other hand, it's also nice to have some people who are competent in that realm.
Yeah, and I guess this to me gets back to like when people on the left would say things like we should reach out to Trump supporters. This kind of all to me is wrapped up in the same concept of like people being disorganized in American political society. So in other words, when people would say to us, oh, you live in Northwest Indiana, what's your success been like reaching out to Trump supporters? And we're like, where are they? Like what they exist here. Yes, they live in subdivisions disproportionately. But there is no local Trump organization. Most of the local Trump supporters don't even interact with the local Republican Party. So it's not like there's an entity that you can, even in places that would be considered quote unquote Trump country, there's no organized entity for us to reach out to. So on the one hand, I am worried about right-wing violence, but I do think that there's a tendency on the left to sort of overblow the organizational capacity of the existing right-wing groups.
Yeah, you see these demonstrations every now and then. They call out their forces and they get outnumbered 4-1 by counter demonstrators.
Right.
I really do wonder how populist they are.
And that's the case in Northwest Indiana, Doug. Like we've had, during the course of the last 4 months, we've had Black Lives Matter protests all over Northwest Indiana with some of the highest levels of participation that the state of Indiana has ever seen for any kind of mobilization. And then the right-wingers, the Trump supporters, tried to hold their rallies. And again, maybe a couple dozen people carrying weapons on the street corner. Very different response. And that's in Northwest Indiana. And I know, again, that's anecdotal, but I just can't emphasize this enough for my left-wing progressive friends on the coast who I think see what's happening throughout the country and go, holy shit, like are there tens of millions of these Trump people with guns that are organized? And I mean, from my perspective, the answer to that is no. They seem far more disorganized than even the left is in some ways.
Well, I think, I'm sure you will not be surprised to learn that people on the coast hear the word Indiana and they think it's just, benighted yahoos running around. Obviously it's not. Everything is much more complicated than that. But it's also really good to hear stories like this, for people on the coast to hear stories about the numbers of people who don't live up to that stereotype of benighted yahoos. There are really a lot of good people trying to do good things, and they don't get covered, they don't get noticed, but they're out there, and we should honor and admire them for it.
Well, it's one of the reasons why we tried to plant our flag here in Michigan City. After 2016, Sergio and I, the co-founder of the space, Sergio Kochergin, we met each other in the Marine Corps. We, been best friends ever since and have been involved with different left projects since we got out. And after the 2016 election, it also seemed clear to us that there needed to be like an infrastructure for the left, that, you had Jacobin, you had the DSA, but that we needed actual spaces, that there weren't the union halls and community centers that existed during the 1960s or the 1930s where people could come and gather, create community, develop political plans, get to know each other. And we also figured, why not do that in a place like Northwest Indiana? Of course, this is where I graduated high school, so I do have roots here. But after 2016, it seemed clear to us that if you just allow portions of this country to go, if the left doesn't spend any kind of resources or put any kind of people in these areas, that these areas, the way that I look at it, Doug, living here, this area can go one way or the other. In 2008, it went for Obama for the first time in 44 years. Since 1964, it was the first time Indiana went blue. And then after right-to-work legislation, Citizens United, gerrymandering, and all the rest, we haven't went blue since, and we won't in 2020. But the way that I look at the population in a state like this, it can go one way or the other, and all of it is contingent upon what we do or don't do. So if we're in these communities organizing, there's a chance we can flip places like Iowa, Kentucky, Indiana, et cetera. But if we're not there putting in the work, it's not going to happen organically.
Yeah, I mean, the system has not been good to people who live in these states. I mean, it's people they've just been chewed up and ignored by the powers that be, and for some reason the people who have been left behind somehow feel a little bit too warmly towards some of the people who've abused them. It seems sometimes, but if there's organizing work going on and education work going on, it could really turn that around, because there seems to be a lot of potential there.
Yeah, there is. Our challenge remains that the majority of people, they're very cynical. So it's not that the majority of people where we live are either left or right. It's the majority of people where we live are totally disenchanted with the system. They've been shit on for 30 years, deindustrialization, opioid addictions. Just in our city, 55% of people, according to the United Way, can't even make ends meet. So in a city of 30,000 people in Michigan City, 1/3 of the city's black. You got the east and the west side of the city's falling apart. You got a maximum security prison where people sit on death row. You've got a coal-fired power plant that sits on the north side of town, and you've got a casino that was brought in 1998 to make up for the revenue that was lost because of all the tax cuts. So, I mean, a place like this is just... When people come here from other parts of the country or other parts of the world, my friends from overseas who've visited, they seriously stop, Doug, and they just go, what the fuck, man? They're like, what is going on here? We had no idea that places look like this in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, for somebody like me, driving to upstate New York, it's a very similar experience. We down here around New York City area, we pride ourselves in being rather cosmopolitan. But, you drive up into a place like Geneva, New York, it's like only 200 miles northwest of here. You've got people with roofs that are taped together with duct tape. It's just like Appalachian poverty levels in upstate New York. Just 200 miles from the big urban epicenter here. The country is just so polarized, and so much of it is just falling apart socially and physically.
Yeah, it is, and that's one of the reasons why Bernie's campaign resonated, with so many people in a place like Indiana. One of the reasons why we put a disproportionate... We agree with your political analysis, Doug, that we have to start at the bottom. But one of the reasons why, because the electoral situation is so fucked up in a place like Indiana, one of the reasons why a lot of leftist progressives put so much weight behind a Bernie campaign, and he won this state in 2016 against Clinton, and he would have won the state against Biden if the race would have continued. But it's because a lot of us see that without major state programs, federal programs, that at the state, county, municipal level in a place like Indiana with trifecta Republican control, we're fucked forever. So if we don't, if we don't get people at the federal level to start implementing these programs, and I agree with your strategic sort of approach that this is a long game to change the legislature at the state level. Or how we interact with the Democratic Party. But, that was one of the reasons why we supported the Bernie campaign so much.
Yeah, he's like a once-in-a-lifetime thing. It was something about the moment, but also him. I mean, he's just such a phenomenal character. They don't make many like him.
No, the last question I have for you, I wanted you to talk a little bit about socialism. I know this is a big topic, and maybe in the future we could have you on to talk about it even more at length. But I know Jacobin... Others have been having these series discussions and workshops that I think are really helpful, defining socialism, how you would define it. I know that's a big, broad question to end the conversation on, but I am interested in sort of do you think it's important for us to define the kind of socialism that we're promoting, that we're fighting for, that we're organizing for? Do you think that's something that sort of happens through the process and that you sort of lay out, like, here's the basic principles of what we want. We're never maybe going to get exactly what we want, but let's move toward these things and let's redefine them, revisit them as we move on with our work.
Yeah, that is a big question. I would say if I had to just give a sentence or two definition, I would say it's just, we're looking for a system which organizes economic and social resources to make people happier, healthier, and more secure, and not in accordance with whatever is the most profitable for the owning class. Just collective use of resources for the betterment of all, and reducing the amount of insecurity in people's lives. You're not going to be able to reduce that to zero because life is always going to be precarious and a little bit difficult. But just wanted to make it as just and humane and as peaceful and collegial as possible. I mean, there's another aspect to it. Like, we're all so alienated from each other. People feel like they just have to be self-reliant. If you can't find a job, it's your fault. There's just this idea that if you're not succeeding in life, there's something wrong with you. We need a much more sense of human solidarity. That was one of the beautiful things. It was just a little over a year ago when the Bernie AOC event in Queens, where Bernie's, are you willing to fight for somebody you don't know? That whole not me, us. We're just such atomized individuals in so many ways. Like, just articulating a much more collective notion of responsibility to each other and connection with each other, I think, is important as just defining the material side of it. But and there's a short term. We're talking about certain things the state can do to make people's lives better. Medicare for all, free college tuition, more housing support, income support when people lose their jobs, and then the important aspects of dealing with the climate crisis. The Green New Deal. The two sides of the Green New Deal, the New Deal side, which is the public investment, the redistribution of social agenda, but also the green side in creating an economic and an energy system that will be sustainable for the really long term. So those kinds of things are the things I would emphasize in practical terms. We want to be able to come up with practical ways that could make people's lives better. And if we can talk about our long-term goals of solidarity and collective allocation of resources and all those sorts of things that socialists have traditionally talked about, but we also want to be able to offer people some things in the short term or medium term that will make their lives better. And Medicare for all would certainly do that. Income support for the unemployed would certainly do that. Look what that $600 supplemental unemployment benefit that lasted for a couple of months
make or break
made such an enormous difference in so many people's lives. And if we could have something like that on a more permanent basis, that would be just, and people have that experience now. Millions of people drew those benefits and then had them taken away. And say, this is the kind of thing that a good government program can do. It can make your life better in a very material, immediate way.
The numbers show that the population is on our side. I just watched a report this morning. I think it's upwards of 55-60% of Republicans want the $2 trillion stimulus package passed. And it seems...
people understand that it's just really, really needed. They're just, you see all these numbers about the job market recovering, and we're going to get a GDP report in a couple of days. It's going to show a very strong rebound in the third quarter, but it just doesn't speak to people's lives. I mean, there's still an awful lot of insecurity, unemployment, anxiety about making ends meet. There's going to be a wave of evictions coming in the coming months. So we still need really bold gestures, but we also need, in addition to the kinds of money that's going to come out of a stimulus program, real investment. So much of the country is just falling to pieces, and we need to rebuild the schools, rebuild all the public infrastructure, have a transportation system that won't kill us. In addition to all those kinds of short-term gestures, we need the big long-term stuff too.
Yeah, and I'll just end by saying the people who constantly ask, what is it that could bring some of these Trump supporters or people who are on the fence over to our side? It's major government programs that they can see have an impact in their lives. So I don't think shaming people, I don't think making fun of people, I don't think talking shit to people is going to help our cause, although sometimes that stuff is fun. I think the only way, if you're really serious about bringing some of these people from places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, et cetera, into the fold, it's going to be through those big programs that make a difference in their lives.
Oh, absolutely. And the right understands that. That's why they object to even the slightest concession, even the slightest program. This is why the Republicans don't want to at least most of the congressional Republicans want a very small bailout package because they understand how popular this stuff is and how it only creates a demand for more, and they don't want to get going down that slippery slope.
That's right. Well, hey, Doug, I know we've taken an hour of your time already. I appreciate your time.
Oh, it's great talking to you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll talk again in the future.
Anytime.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.
You've been listening to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we'll talk to you soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parkmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.